Thank you to those of us who are joining us for this conversation called Nothing About Us Without Us, Self-Advocacy for Autistic People. So just to introduce you to the folks who are on this Zoom discussion, we have Lydia X.Z. Brown, who is an attorney, scholar, and social justice activist. We have myself, Ayola White. I'm the emerging technology librarian at the Jersey City Free Public Library, and I'm the moderator. We have Tabitha Lee, who is our American Sign Language interpreter, and Allison Blumenfeld, who is the head of information services and who will be looking at audience questions as they come in. So the structure of today's event, I have about 35 minutes of prepared questions that I came up with ahead of time. We'll have a 5-minute break after that, and then 15 to 20 minutes of questions from the audience, if there are any. So without further ado, the first question I have for Lydia X.Z. Brown is, what does self-advocacy mean to you, and why is it important?
This is Lydia. Thank you so much for inviting me here, Ayola. I'm really glad to join you this afternoon. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. I'm wearing a t-shirt that says non-compliance is a social skill. It comes from Ruti Reagan, R-U-T-I, R-E-G-A-N. Self-advocacy means more than one thing. Sometimes when we say self-advocacy, we are talking about how disabled people are able to speak up for ourselves, to identify and to say out loud, or in writing, or in typing, or in signing, or with pictures, what it is that we want and need and desire, what we do not want. Self-advocacy can also mean the movement of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, advocating for ourselves and for what our communities need. Some people talk about self-advocacy in ways that treat it as only an individual thing. Individual people who can speak up only for their own selves and never really have a say or an opinion about what other people may want or about what a whole community may need. More importantly than that, though, self-advocacy is the entire movement of people with developmental and intellectual disabilities in particular, who are advocating for better policies, for better research, for a better society, for better culture, so that we can be valued and honored as human and as full members of society alongside everybody else.
Thank you. So the way that I actually came across Lydia's work was I came across the website for the Autistic People of Color Fund, and I was really impressed with it and the philosophy behind it. And I was wondering if you can speak about how the fund got started and what has its impact been so far.
This is Lydia. The fund began in 2018 with a combination of proceeds from sales of the first edition of All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism, an anthology on autism and race, and award money from the American Association of People with Disabilities that I'd received for my advocacy work at that point. That combined amount of money was something like $9,000 or $10,000, something like that. And those funds allowed us to give microgrants of between $100 to $500 directly to individual autistic people of color. And the money was gone in just a couple of months after we announced the launch of the fund. Since then, we have given out nearly $100,000 to autistic people of color around the world of all ages from many different specific racial and ethnic communities. Autistic people of color who come from Black, Brown, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, and mixed race communities have all benefited from money from this fund. We practice a politic that I describe as two core principles. Number one is mutual aid, which is that those of us who have always led and stewarded the fund are autistic people of color. We come from the community that the fund is meant to benefit and support. And number two, of redistributive justice. That is, our communities, because of ableism, because of capitalism, because of white supremacy, have always been subjected to extractive and exploitative practices that have deprived and denied us of access to resources, that have stolen our resources, that have hoarded our resources, that continue to occupy Native people's land. And so to return money to communities that have been extracted from and exploited is a way of redistributing resources materially to the communities that have had those resources taken, often in many cases violently, from us through the legacies of settler colonization, of chattel enslavement, of violence done against immigrants of color, especially migrant workers, and the violence of institutionalization and incarceration that have always most affected Black and Brown disabled people. The Autistic People of Color Fund is not going to end white supremacy or capitalism, but it is a way for us to materially support and affirm one another's value and worth today in the face of systems and an entire world that often is bent on disappearing us.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting the menu to unmute myself, but I actually had a small follow-up question to that. And thank you again for that very candid answer. One update that I saw on the Autistic People of Color Fund website, and I'm sorry, I should actually introduce myself again. This is Aola again speaking. Was one of the updates I saw on the website is that the fund cannot be used for what is called applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. Can you talk more about that stance and why the fund decided that that was important?
This is Lydia. We have always opposed the use of ABA, or applied behavior analysis. It is widely touted as the single most commonly used evidence-based treatment for autism in the United States. But ABA has its origins in the very same research used to create conversion therapy as used on queer, trans, and other LGBTQIA youth. ABA is based on the premise that through some combination of reward and punishment, clinicians or therapists can change a person's behavior. The origins of ABA are a lot more sinister than that description might lead you to believe. We might recognize that it is true that if people are incentivized for better or worse, that might encourage somebody to choose to adopt a certain behavior or to let go of one. For example, that's how marketing and advertisement works. If you advertise enough, then you might incentivize somebody through the promise of a reward to buy their product, or through the promise of shame, you will not be hip anymore. You will look bad to, again, buy their product. Unless you buy this product, something bad is going to happen to you. When we're talking about human beings, we have to remember that the person who pioneered the use of ABA, both on children who he wanted to, quote, prevent homosexuality in, and in autistic children, in separate research projects, both funded by the National Institutes of Health in the 1960s, this person, Ola Ivarlovas, OLEIVARLOVAAS, deliberately designed ABA as a means of controlling people's behavior to force assimilation and conformity into expectations of what boys are supposed to be like, as well as what people are supposed to be like. He famously wrote about autistic people in his book, he wrote that an autistic person has all of the pieces necessary to form a human being. but has to be put together. That's not the exact quote, it's a slight paraphrase. But essentially what Lovas was saying was that autistic people are not actually human beings, that we look a little bit like humans, but we're not really human. His experiments involved emotional and even physical torture and abuse, which today most ABA therapists will tell you, well, we don't do that. That's not how the field is anymore. We're not like the old ABA. But in reality, they are. ABA that claims to be about positive reinforcement, that claims to be about punishment only in the sense of withholding things as a way of incentivizing someone to do better. Like, you'll get an ice cream treat if you do this thing that we want you to do, or you'll get computer time back if you comply with these things, you obey, you achieve a certain number of rehearsals of a particular kind of behavior, is still manipulation. It is, as some autistic activists have talked about in the past, holding hostage the things that might bring us joy or pleasure, or just be able to exist in the world. So the fund cannot be used if someone applies for a grant for ABA. But this is a bit obviated now. We had to announce that policy during a portion of time in which we had a large number of non-autistic parents who were applying for money from the fund on behalf of their autistic children. And we instituted a policy effective in September of 2020 that parents who were not autistic themselves could no longer apply for money because that wasn't the purpose or the intent of the fund. The purpose and the intent of the fund to begin with was to directly give money to autistic people of color ourselves, not to our parents, not to our caregivers. And some people might say, well, what about my child? My child is 6 years old. How can my child be helped? And the answer is, we're not the fund for you. You're looking for a family support fund, not us. Now, if your 6-year-old is able to say, I want this thing, then your 6-year-old is welcome, like any other 6-year-old, autistic or not, to say, I want help with this thing. Like, can I get a prize money or something from this? And you can help your kid fill out a form, but you can't fill it out for your child. And you cannot say, this is what we want money for. It can only be what the actual autistic person of color themselves wants. And unfortunately, because of how both ableism and ageism work in society, most parents, even if they are supportive and care very deeply about their children, are not in a place where they can articulate what their child wants for themselves, rather than what they would prefer to have for their family. So we had to announce that policy of not allowing funds to be used for ABA back when we did consider parents who had applied for money from the fund if they were applying to benefit their child. But since we no longer allow parents to apply for money directly from the fund, it's not really a necessary policy to have to state over and over again. It remains as available information as part of our political commitment. And just noting that while we believe certainly that every person has the ability to exercise their own autonomy, and there may be an autistic adult out there in the world who would like to try ABA for themselves, I'm not going to stop that person from doing that, but we're not going to use our money from the fund to pay for that. I will add to that, most autistic adults who've experienced ABA describe it as abusive. And the vast majority of them now experience some form of trauma caused by ABA.
Thank you for allowing me to tack that question on. This is Aola speaking again. It's just something that came up when you were speaking about your original answer to this question, and I wanted to have that context as well. So my next question is, what is your opinion on the wider landscape of charities, nonprofits, and political projects that aim to serve autistic people? Do you feel hopeful, pessimistic, something else?
This is Lydia. We have to be very clear about what we're talking about. Are we talking about organizations and projects that are actually led by autistic people? Or are we talking about organizations and projects that are led on behalf of autistic people, but by non-autistic people? And the vast majority of such organizations, especially if they call themselves charities, are led by non-autistic people who purport to know what is best for our community, what we want, what we need, and almost always without actually listening to or following the lead of actually autistic people. Organizations and projects that are led by actually autistic people are severely under-resourced, underfunded, and deprived of the same platforms and recognition as those organizations that are led by non-autistic and otherwise non-disabled people. And I can tell you that, right? Like if I ask you, what organizations have you heard of related to autism? Most people will say something like Autism Speaks, the Autism Society. They might name a local charity that operates in their city that's probably not led by autistic people. But if I give a list of here's just some organizations that are actually led by autistic people, most people would have no idea what I'm talking about. They might, if I'm lucky, recognize one of the names. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Felicity House, Foundations for Divergent Minds, Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy, Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, the Academic Autistic Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education. Right, these are just a few of the names of autistic-led organizations and projects. There are many others. That's just a handful of them, but most people wouldn't recognize most of those names. And for me, this question is actually a bit misplaced, and it's not the right question to be asking, because the right question to be asking is, where do you see the disparities and the continued systemic inequities affecting autistic-led organizations and projects continuing to persist? What enables those disparities to persist? And the answer is ableism. And how can we challenge or change the harm happening now? And the answer is maybe actually listen to autistic people and other disabled people in general. Now, a lot of people still have it in their minds because of ableism that any autistic people that are capable of talking or writing or being part of some kind of an organization must not really be disabled and really have no place doing advocacy work. And they will say, well, you're not like my child. The reason why we need to support organizations led by non-autistic people is because otherwise, who's going to speak up for children like mine? You can talk. Now, here's the thing. Someone being able to talk is not an indicator of either the presence or the absence of any other skill or impairment. Someone might be able to talk, but that doesn't tell you anything about whether or not they can hold down a job or live on their own, or whether they can make food for themselves, or whether they can remember to take a shower, or whether they have the physical capability of walking around on their own without assistance. It doesn't tell you anything about their ability to go to school or not, with or without specific accommodations. It certainly does not tell you anything about what specific support needs they need during the night, or at the worst moment, or in their best moment. You have no idea. A lot of those folks believe in the ableist idea that all disability is bad. So anybody who says disability is not inherently a tragedy, they assume that we have it wrong. They assume, well, disability has to be this bad thing. So if you think disability isn't necessarily a tragedy, then you don't really know what disability is. And I challenge you to go to any room full of autistic people when, being in a crowded room of people can happen again, and ask, how many of you have ever experienced being homeless? And a large number of autistic people will answer in the affirmative. How many autistic people have ever experienced abuse? Virtually all of us have experienced at least one form of abuse: spiritual, emotional, psychological, physical, financial, or sexual. Virtually all of us. Ask any autistic person, how many times have you lost a job? And most autistic people have had some experience of either a hostile work environment, not being hired because of outright discrimination, or being forced to leave a job. Ask autistic people as a whole, have you felt that your medical needs have been attended to? And a lot of autistic people will tell you that no, they have not. Ask most autistic people, do you have other conditions, other disabilities, other chronic illnesses, any psych disabilities, and most of us can name several. And whether or not they've been diagnosed professionally, or we're still in the process of attempting to find a medical professional that will actually take somebody seriously. And it is autistic people and other disabled people who have always been organizing in our own best interest, because we can't rely upon or trust somebody else to do it for us, especially those of us who are multiply marginalized. Because even within autistic-led projects and organizations, the majority, especially of those that are well-funded, are led by white autistic people, not by autistic people of color. And that's beginning to change a little bit, but it's not by a lot, and certainly not enough. So the question that we should really be talking about is, what continued effects of systematic ableism do autistic people's own organizations and projects face? And what are autistic people doing about it? And how can non-autistic people actually support us and offer solidarity to the work that we are doing for ourselves?
Thank you once again. This is Aola, and thank you for reframing that question. I feel like that's a much more helpful framework for thinking about this topic. So the next question: you were a co-editor for the book All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living with Racialized Autism. How do you define racialized autism?
This is Lydia. This was a way of describing being autistic while also being a person of color. The first edition of the book is no longer in print. We chose to discontinue publication last month. After many conversations in private, among ourselves as the editorial team, and with other members of our community, when we learned that we had published several different pieces of racist content and published in some racist ways. The intent of the anthology was to highlight and center the voices of autistic people of color, speaking about our lives, our politics, our organizing, and our vision for the future. And we hope that that vision will carry through to a planned second edition. The name that we had chosen when we published the first edition at the time of that project was meant to reflect that when most people think about autism, even people of color, we assume that we're talking about white autistic people. That's the assumption. If someone says autism, the assumption is a white person and a man or a boy. And for all of us as autistic people of color, we recognize, number one, that among the autistic population in the world, we are actually a global majority. Just as people of color are a global majority compared to white people, autistic people of color are a global majority compared to white autistic people. But most people, even people of color, do not think about this because that is how intense and how pervasive colonization really is. To the point where we can only understand ourselves as an other. We are taught to do that by white supremacy. And we apply that thinking to every other conversation and every other community that we are thinking about. So to name, we are talking about racialized autism, is to center and explicitly name the experiences of autistic people of color as needing to be named, and needing to be named in opposition to, and I don't mean opposition like going against, I mean opposition like as a juxtaposition, right? And as a juxtaposition with white autistic people's experiences. That not naming white autism or racialized autism is a way of rendering invisible how white supremacy operates.
This is Aola once again, and thank you once again. I feel like you're just giving like totally fire answers. I really love the way that you're speaking about this, Lydia. Next question I have is, what advice do you have for fellow autistic and otherwise disabled folks who want to practice self-advocacy and activism in general?
This is Lydia. This is a very hard question to answer because there are so many different tactics and strategies and spaces to operate from in doing the work of activism, advocacy, and community organizing. And I can't tell somebody, let alone an infinitely large group of strangers, what you need to do or what you can't do other than don't be an asshole, right? Try not to be an asshole and try to put into the world the kind of things that we want to take from the world. And that's very abstract and it's very general. And I know that that can be hard, especially for many of us who are neurodivergent. I would suggest that one thing we can all do and all practice doing is learning from the people who are already doing the kind of work that we hope to be part of. And if you don't know where those people are yet, that's not because they don't exist, because they almost certainly do, but it's because you haven't yet learned where they are. And you may need help if you are not very skilled at using the internet, if you are at home because of COVID and it's not really easy to go out somewhere, you may need help with looking up information about people and organizations and projects that are doing the kind of work that you would like to be part of. Or you might be able to do that on your own because you've been on the internet since you were 5 years old and you don't need anyone telling you how to do that. I would suggest it is always helpful to look to, listen to, learn from, and follow the lead of the people who are already doing the kind of work you want to do. And at the same time, to resist the urge to either place these people on a pedestal such that you believe them to be free of possible critique or criticism, which is not helpful for our movement, or that you are just waiting for a reason to tear somebody entirely apart. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying that we cannot criticize. We need to criticize. And sometimes we need to cancel. But what I am talking about is that it is very common in many activist and advocacy spaces for people who are doing very prominent work to be put on a pedestal such that they are either praised as complete without fault or demonized as basically Satan. And there's a lot of ways that other people have talked about this too. I'm not the first. I hope I'm not the last. But it is very easy if you are just getting involved in a community or a movement to be wrapped up in cults of personality. And that's a real danger to movement. At the end of the day, what we are working for is not ego, is not recognition, is not to be necessarily liked or popular or even in agreement with each other all the time, so long as we're not denying each other's humanity, like in that quote from Son of Baldwin. But we are in this work for the long haul. We are in this work for an ultimate vision of liberation, a world without ableism, a world without white supremacy, a world without misogyny. And in our community, self-advocacy means something very particular. And we talked about this a little while ago when we just signed on, that self-advocacy means the ways in which we can speak up for ourselves. And it also means how we can speak up for our whole communities, communities that are always presumed to be incompetent, to be lacking agency and voice. And those presumptions will continue to exist probably for a very long time. I said this a lot, and again, many people have before, I'm not the first to. The work we do, we are in it for the long haul. It will not be quick or easy, and we may not live to see its fruits in our lifetime. I am not Jewish, but many people in my life are, and I find myself very informed by the Jewish value of tikkun olam, Tikkun Olam, which means to repair the world. I think of the work that we do as activists, organizers, and advocates as the work of repairing the world. How can we address the harms this world has done to ourselves, to our relationships, to our communities and neighborhoods, to the entire fabric of our society and culture, and work to repair that harm?
This is Aola again, and I feel like the way that you answered this question really dovetails into the next question. So thank you for that. It's almost like you got the questions ahead of time. When you think of liberation for autistic people and disability liberation more broadly, what do you imagine?
This is Lydia. I'd actually forgotten that you'd sent me the questions ahead of time, and I'm only remembering them as you asked them. So it's like getting them for the first time, almost. You know, pandemic brain land. Nobody is able to really just feel great anymore. We're all dealing with a lot. Liberation for me means the ability to feel free of fear, of violence, to be free of violence, when we can all live authentically, self-determined lives where we alone and in community define for ourselves what freedom and safety mean. That liberation is where ableism and white supremacy and settler colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy no longer exist. They are history. Where every single day we can feel what justice is like and taste what freedom is like. I ask people that question often, to imagine what it would feel like to feel justice constantly, what it would be like to taste freedom, what it would be like not to be afraid of fear itself, of shame, of being considered a burden, not to be afraid of people's violence, misunderstanding, hate, refusal to support, not to be afraid of neglect, not to be afraid of dying alone, not to be afraid that our entire lives will be spent wondering how we can keep breathing in the face of a world and systems and structures that would deprive us of life and breath. Liberation is something that is so far removed from the world as we know it today, a world that is steeped in profoundly violent ableism and anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity and anti-Asianness, a world that is profoundly violent towards queer folks and trans folks. We don't experience liberation now. The closest that we can get for many of us are moments spent in community with people who share identities and experiences and commitment to informed and political struggle. But that's not the same thing as living in a world where we no longer have to struggle against systems, structures, and institutions that would take not just our lives, but our whole communities. I think of liberation for disabled people too, as meaning not just autonomy over our bodies and minds, and freedom of fear of violence and harm from medical systems, from the educational system, from the family regulation system, from other carceral spaces, but also as what it would mean for each of us to be able to be held and witnessed with love and with care, to experience access, to have our needs attended to, and to be able to receive and offer care out of genuine love, out of solidarity, because that is what it means to live justly and in right relationship with each other, and without any of the trappings of the world we live in now, where we are taught that to have to receive care is a marker of shame, of burden, of guilt, and of less than full personhood.
This is Aola once again, and thank you once again. I feel like I keep saying thank you, thank you, thank you, because I just really appreciate your perspective and all of the insights that you've given us. So that was the end of my prepared questions. Now we can take a 5-minute break. And next up, Ali will be checking to see our Facebook page if there are any questions, but for now we can take a break for our voices, a break for our signing hands, and hopefully get up and get some water or stretch or whatever we need to do. Hello again, everyone. This is Aola. I hope we didn't venture too far. Don't know if Lydia or Allie are still there.
Yes, so we don't have any questions yet here on Facebook, but we can give it maybe another minute or so as
Okay.
people come back from the break.
Fair enough. This is Aola again. One thing that just came to mind. I don't know. I guess one way of asking this is there a question that you wish I had asked you or something that you especially want to talk about?
This is Lydia. I think there's an echo because you have the Facebook feed playing.
Oh, apologies. I'll fix that.
This is Lydia. I think it's fixed now. One thing that I wish we all asked each other more these days was what we are doing that gives us joy or pleasure in a time when it's really hard to find that. For me, that's a lot of my cooking and my baking, and we were talking about that before our event. I'd actually like to ask you, while you're here, what's bringing you joy?
Let's see. This is kind of silly, but I've gotten back into playing Pokemon Sword, which I played a lot last year. But even though I got the expansion pack, I didn't go back to it until just now, and it's still pretty fun. I like, speaking of cooking, I like that in this game you can cook for your Pokemon, and they really love it. And they're just happy to camp with you and cook with you. It just, like, that's the best part of the game.
This is Lydia. That's excellent. I didn't know that about Pokemon Sword.
Yeah, this is Aola again. Was the question also to Allie or to
Yeah.
Tabitha?
What is bringing each of you joy at this time?
Well, it's sort of a cop-out answer because it's probably every parent's answer, but my daughter has really gotten me through this past year, just watching her grow. She's a little over a year old. And she just keeps me going. And just those little moments we get to share. And yeah, it's really special to just be able to focus on somebody who has no idea what's going on. And just look at her and hope I can do my part to make this world better for her, and that I can teach her that she has the tools to make it better as well, no matter who she ends up being.
This is Lydia. That's not a cop-out answer at all.
Thanks for saying that.
Children are literally our future. I wrote a series of lesson plans for Amplifier's We the Future project about disability justice. They're aimed at middle and high school students, so possibly a bit older than where your daughter is now. But one of the reasons I was so excited to take on that project a couple years ago is because our children do not typically learn about movements for justice or liberation all that much. And to the extent that they do, most curricula and lesson plans tend to be very sanitized and whitewashed and very centered on stories of white saviorism and tokenized and co-opted stories of marginalized people doing something related to advocacy, whether it's the ways in which whitewashed textbooks talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and omit discussion of his radicalism, the ways in which textbooks present Helen Keller as this super inspirational, super crip overcoming story. And again, don't talk about her radical organizing in labor movement, for example. And I want our children to have opportunities to learn about and to learn from multiply marginalized people who are on the front lines. They are our future. Many children are already leading organizing efforts. And I am excited to know where they're going to go next.
Agreed. Amazing. Thank you so much for everything you shared. I will just say we still don't have any questions coming in, but we did have a comment from somebody who said great program. So that's always nice to receive. But unfortunately, no questions right now.
Okay, so I suppose, this is Ayola again. I will ask Lydia if you would like to wait a minute or two for any additional questions, or if you would like to go ahead and start closing. And I do have a closing slide as well.
This is Lydia. That's up to you. I'm happy to do either. I teach. I'm very used to no questions sometimes.
This is Ayola again. I will go ahead and go on to our closing slide. I don't know if maybe I'll like reverse psychology somebody to like, hey, wait, I got a question. So I'll just move on a little bit. And so here are the last few links that people can check out, as well as some upcoming events. So I have thank you for joining us. To connect more with Lydia, that you could visit their, I don't know why I said visit website blog, that's not correct at all. Visit their website, which is lydiaxzbrown.com. You can also find more about the Autistic People of Color Fund, both through information about the fund and ways to donate to the fund through the links provided. And with the library, with Jersey City Free Public Library, we will be offering 2 other related events. The first is on Thursday, April 22nd, and it is at 1 p.m. It is a life skills in the workplace and adult community program. And then on Friday, April 30th at 6 p.m., an event called Parenting on the Spectrum with Morénike, Giwa, Onaiwu. And I want to thank everybody for attending this event, and thank you to Lydia for speaking. Thank you to Ali for monitoring the Facebook, and to Tabitha for interpreting for us today. And I hope everybody has a safe and restful evening.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, take care, everyone.